Hello, everyone. So, this is Canada is not a suburb of the U.S. A panel where four Canadians or people living in the country currently known as Canada will apologetically rant and talk about elements of our national and cultural identities and how they inform game design. How business concerns work in terms of and how business will affect us as Canadians, and answer your questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the stream chat, and our lovely moderator Avanel will pass them along to us. So to get started, why don't we introduce ourselves? My name is Jason Pitre. He, him. I am a Acadian game designer, born in Victoria, raised in Ottawa, and currently technically living in Quebec. From Acadian means I'm from an ethnically French background, but I'm an Anglophone. We'll talk about why this matters later. All right, next. To my right, Sen.
Oh, hi, I'm Sen-Foong Lim. I'm a Chinese-Canadian game designer living in London, Ontario, Canada, which is actually further south than some places in the United States. And so my identity as a Chinese-Canadian does inform my game design, and we'll talk about that soon, I guess. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Nicole.
Hi there, I'm Nicole. Just a little note, all of your video is currently a little circle for me, so if I can't see you or I'm looking at things weird, that's why. But I can hear everybody fine, so perfect. I'm Nicole Winchester. I am a game designer living in the city known as Toronto. That is on unceded territory in Ontario, which is also on unceded territory, I believe, or territory that is under a treaty that was not honored, is probably the more accurate description of what it is. And yeah, I was born in East York, Ontario. I was raised in Peterborough, Ontario, which is probably one of the whitest places in all of Canada. And that all informs my design. I am of Finnish Canadian descent, particularly Ingrian descent. And that's me.
Excellent. So, Christoph.
Good morning. My name is Christoph Sapinsky. I'm a game designer out of British Columbia. I made a little game called Free Spacer. And I am in Vancouver. Where else would I be? I grew up in the interior, which is a term we use for north of here, in a place called Sicamous. Yes. And I am also on ceded territory, but most of BC is, as there's like 104% land claims on the province or something. Anyways, so there you go. And I'm very excited and very tired at 6 a.m. So let's talk about this stuff.
Yes, thank you for getting up so early.
Yeah, thank you. So in order to move forward, let's give a quick 101 on what are the parts of Canada in terms of geographic and cultural regions that we need to talk about. So going from east to west, because that's how we always do this, we'll start with Newfoundland and Labrador. You have to include the Labrador part, or they'll be angry at you. Now,
Free Newfoundland. Free Newfoundland.
Now, Newfoundland was a portion of. It was an independent nation until about 1944.
1949, I believe. Yeah.
I didn't know if it was during or after World War II.
It's in around there anyway.
Yeah, and it got brought into Confederation at that point. because of effectively economic crises, and there was insufficient. Effectively, people were starving, and they needed to come into Confederation. That's where the Labrador part got added on to Newfoundland, and Quebec's still angry about it. Big thing there is Ottawa, the headquarters and capital, screwed over the cod fisheries by really mismanaging it, which meant that pretty much the giant economic heart of the province went up in smoke and possibly drowned.
Confederation didn't work out so well for them.
So it's economically fraught, and it's in a rough place, and it's got a very distinct, unique culture because it's known as the Rock. It's this island just off the coast that depends on ferries.
All we care about is the lobster.
Exactly.
They talk funny there too. They have
We have to
specific
mock
accents.
Yeah.
In their own time,
they have a very
but that's just a
culture. Yeah.
Yeah. They're half an hour off. So whenever you listen to Canadian radio, it's like 10 a.m., 10:30 Newfoundland.
Mm-hmm. 10 o'clock on the mainland, 10:30 in Newfoundland.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much their culture, right?
Yep. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So
there's a whole musical about it.
Next in line, I am legally obliged to say this in French. Is Quebec.
Quebec. Pig. Way.
Oui, ouais.
Way.
Donc, comme un Québécois fier, je dois parler en français tout le temps, but since most of you are anglophones, I'm not going to do that. Quebec
I understood that. Yes.
Quebec is a nation of its own with a long history. Long story short, it was the French colony that wound up losing in the war, the French and English war, back in 1790 or so. 1770.
And they're still mad about that too. They're still mad about that too. And
as part of effectively the terms, some things got hard-coded in. Specifically, the Quebec maintained the ability to speak in French and to maintain the Catholic Church. There was actually effectively a devil's bargain going on there with the church and the English state, which said, look, you let us stay Catholic and stay French, and we won't have a problem. Otherwise, we're going to get Reformation on your ass. So, so it meant that you wound up having a very unique, separate society because the language barrier was a very real thing. Now, of course, English Canada was historically rather abusive towards French Canadians on a whole and Quebecers in specific. And the church had an outsized influence in Quebec until about the 60s.
They were called Lower Canada. I mean, it's true.
It's down the river.
Yeah.
I mean, but
that is also true.
So you had to effectively. There was a lot of English businesses in Montreal and the whatnot, and there was a long history of saying, so you are you need to speak English to work here because we're the English bosses. And when you got we're overthrowing the church and we're expressing our national identity in the 60s in the Quiet Revolution. There was a lot of backlash, and effectively it's okay, so we kicked out the church. Okay, what can we do next? And that triggered all the independence separatism movement, which led to two referendums, one of which was in the 90s, which was very close and led to Canada led to Quebec still being in Canada.
That
an
was some
uneasy
scary
truth.
stuff. Let me
So
tell
you
you.
can
That.
have a referendum or election or whatever that's really, really close, and then it kind of works out. It's good to
There
know.
were actually 2 referendums about separation. They were, the second one was not as scary as the first, but the first, like, the people, we were legit worried that Quebec might leave the country. How that might logistically work with it right in the middle of the country, we weren't sure, but there was some concern.
Yeah, because literally Quebec divides the country. So all of the Atlantic and Newfoundland is on one side, and Ontario and everything west is on the other. So
There's Quebec in the middle.
Yep.
It's like
It was stressful.
It's like a
Mm-hmm.
stuffed donut.
And there were a whole bunch of other cultural things that we'll talk about later. So next up is Toronto.
There's no Ontario. There's just Toronto. That's right.
You got to pronounce it correctly.
Toronto.
Toronto.
I thought it's just
Or
pronounced
TDOT for
TO.
short.
The 6. That's kind of out of fashion now, but you know.
So I'll pass this on to one of you fine folks.
I live here, so Toronto is the center of the universe. Nothing exists in Canada except for Toronto. We are the greatest city in the world. We're also basically Toronto thinks it's awesome, and Toronto is the city with the belief in itself, greatest belief in itself in one hand, and the greatest inferiority complex in the world in the other hand. Toronto was pretty much the most boring city in the world until the 1970s. That's the narrative anyway. But if you look into the history of Toronto, in the 1800s, Toronto was fascinating. There were houses of prostitution and circus riots and all sorts of things happening all the time. It was pretty. Apparently, the island was a hotbed of gambling and smuggling. We have an island just off of in the lake, and there's a ferry that goes to it, and it's like just a nice place to hang out now. But apparently, like all kinds of shady stuff was happening out there in the 1800s, and I can't find hardly anything about it except a few mentions. And it's probably because in the 70s and 80s, Toronto was cleaned up, and there was a specific Toronto the Good campaign. Toronto is supposed to be a nice place where bad things don't happen. But though we have a lot less of the things that happen in any big city, we still have all those things. So a lot of the things that you hear about people saying, oh, there's no racism in Canada, there's no this, there's no that. We have police shootings in Toronto, we have police killings, we have all of the issues of urbanism. We have a declining transport system, all of those problems. It's just because, which I'll probably go into later, because it's Canadian and because we have this concept of Canada being this liberal utopia, everyone's like, oh, Toronto's so great. And Toronto is great in a lot of ways. You feel a lot safer than a lot of places in the world, but I feel equally safe in other countries. Like Hong Kong and Toronto, to me, are very similar places in some ways. And it's not just because of the Chinese kind of community. There's a lot of similarities in terms of the cultural makeup. Parts of Abu Dhabi reminded me of Toronto. So we have a very culturally diverse city. People tend to hang out together a lot. But the cultures are also very separated, so people kind of hang out in their own spaces, and own neighborhoods, and own communities too.
And then
Except
there's the
when the
rest of
Raptors
Ontario,
win.
I guess, right? The rest of Ontario,
and then there's the
is pretty much divided into sort of 3 areas, I guess. Things that are south of Toronto, things that are the north, which is most everything else, that big chunk of Ontario. That's where I'm from originally, and then I moved to the southern little peninsula that ends up jutting down into Michigan. And then there's where Jason is around, which is the Ottawa Valley and all that kind of stuff up there. So the rest of Ontario is huge. I don't know if it's the biggest province, but it's pretty darn big, and it has the biggest population. Now, most of that population is centered around Toronto, obviously, and then all along the border. But that's normal for Canada in general. Our population is literally kind of just riding that line of what is America and what is Canada? Well, it's where the border is, wherever the population of Canada is probably where the border is. The rest of Ontario, if we get into the whole French English thing, I think is mostly on the Anglophone side of things, but there are definitely pockets of French speakers and French language issues across Ontario. In terms of multiculturalism, I think, obviously, as Nicole is saying, that while the urban centers, just like many other cities and many other countries, the urban centers tend to be very liberal, very multicultural. As you get further and further away from those, into the desolation of the north, like where I'm from, it's less and less like that, and you could be literally the only person of color out of like a population of 10, 20,000 people, and you're like the only one, and it's kind of strange. The other thing to note, and this is across Canada, is that our Indigenous population tends to, not all of them, but tends to live on reserves, and reserves are a part of our lives. In Canada, if you at all interact with people from other cultures, so
that's the thing, right?
right,
Yeah.
So there are a lot of issues as of late, and all the way through our history, of course, that dealt with residential schooling and with land claims, as we've talked a little bit about. But they seem to come to a head in Canada much more than they do in America. Probably because of the whole idea that Nicole brought up, that we actually have a treaty that colonists are not honoring, and that's what
we have several treaties.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
many
I mean,
treaties.
Like a pile.
If you want to talk
With
about
the exception of like
treaties, we can go through the list, but we're not going to because it would take forever. But yeah, currently right now, Canada is in a state of, I would say, reconciliation attempting, and I wouldn't even say that. I said we're just dealing with the fallout from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that ended a couple years ago, and it's taken like 2 or 3 years to not even start anything. But that's also very Canadian.
Yeah.
There
We're suing kids. We're suing First Nation kids for wanting clean water.
yeah,
we're ignoring court orders.
Yes.
Can't forget that.
Yes.
And for the water thing, so there's 61 reserves that don't have clean drinking water. Some of them are literally their water is radioactive. So you can't even boil it. It's just, if this touches your skin, you may die.
One is within, I was going to say one is within like 20 minutes drive of Toronto.
Yeah, they're not far from urban centers. That's the thing. It's environmental racism, if you really want to get down to it. So, which we can if you'd like to.
Yeah, totally.
The whole fisheries thing, right? That's happening out in the East Coast right now.
Oh, the lobster.
Let's move on to Manitoba. What's happening in Manitoba?
Sorry, what's Manitoba? Is Manitoba part of the West?
It's a big square.
Is it part of the West?
Before Saskatchewan. Winnipeg is in there.
Someone in the chat asked about Thunder Bay, and I'm not sure if they were trolling or not.
Thunder Bay.
Thunder Bay. There's actually a podcast about Thunder Bay. If you are serious, there's a podcast about Thunder Bay done by Canada Land. That I haven't listened to.
I have. It's awesome.
Yeah, I haven't listened to it, but apparently it's great. It's hosted by Ryan McMahon, who's an Indigenous Canadian. I mean, a Canadian comedian. He is a Canadian too. He may not consider himself Canadian. A lot of Indigenous people don't, because Canadian is sort of like a term that's put on them. They're rather like they're not necessarily Canadians. They're citizens of their own nations first, and we just decided they're Canadians. So They don't always consider themselves that. I don't know where Ryan stands, but he's Anishinaabe, and I think he's around for where I'm from, actually. And he hosted this podcast on Thunder Bay about kind of crime in Thunder Bay, I believe. Sen?
Yeah, it's a lot about the criminality that goes around in T-Bay that has to deal with politics and race. So it's a pretty dark. It's very dark. It's a very dark story.
Could you not? Sorry,
but
I have your
the cat. But if you're interested
Another
in
cat.
relations in Thunder Bay, which are so Thunder Bay, if you don't know where Thunder Bay is like probably the biggest population center in the north of Ontario. I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, which is probably like the third biggest, and then there's Sudbury. And so, but the funny thing is, like, it's all like 4 to 8 hours apart from each other. So when I grew up, to get to Thunder Bay is a hell of a trip. It's like 8 hours driving along the north coast of Lake Superior, where you're almost falling into the water. So it's not easy to get to. It's far. I worked there for many summers. And it is a hotbed of racial politics because of the numbers and the population density that's there. Anyway, yeah. So
it's also a huge hockey place, but they don't have their own hockey team, which
right.
is irony that is very Canadian.
What happened to the Lightning?
It's travel.
Did they move their OHL team?
I actually don't know. I haven't kept up with OHL.
I meant NHL, but okay.
Oh,
And yes,
NHL.
talking about
Thunder Bay
hockey
NHL.
is our national pastime.
Yeah, so Thunder Bay will probably never get an NHL team because of where it's located, and that's just the logic of it. There's no way for people to get to it other than plane.
Like people from Toronto fly to Thunder Bay. People don't drive. It's like an over 20-hour drive, basically.
Yeah, it's like 16 hours if you go straight.
So let's tackle the prairies in the west.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. We spend so much time on Ontario because obviously, right?
Well, of course.
Yeah, well, we're used to it.
Sen or Nicole, do you want to take over for the prairies and Alberta? And then we'll throw all of BC at poor Christoph.
I think Christoph should take Alberta as well.
Okay, that's fair.
Okay. Well, that's gonna
Yeah, Alberta.
Since they're totally the same thing, right?
Right. That's exactly
right. I'm going to be right back. I'm just going to stop my cat from eating something.
Okay.
That she shouldn't.
The prairies are very flat. The end.
Oh, you're not eating it now? Okay.
The Canadian Shield.
Never mind.
Yeah, the prairies are definitely flat. They are where kind of our center of agriculture is, for the most part, in terms of grains, but there's a lot of agriculture all over Canada. You just don't think of it as that because you think of, the breadbasket of Canada in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But there's more than that. What else is there about the prairies?
Winnipeg is where. Isn't Winnipeg where? Winnipeg is where our Museum of Human Rights is. That had recently. Sorry?
There's several cool things about Winnipeg. Like the Red River Colony, and 2, that's where all the data of Canada is stored.
It's also where the Human Rights Museum is that recently had human rights complaints against it for sexual harassment and racism.
Yeah, well,
that'll happen.
Irony.
And then Regina is actually like the seat of our national police force, the Mounties, the RCMP. And that has a very storied and colored history, emphasis on color. They are at the same time as being this proud, weirdly Canadian iconic thing, they are also a source of great embarrassment, I think, being a person of color. And working on reserves, The RCMP
They're-
is this weird thing that you're simultaneously proud of and also super embarrassed about. I mean, maybe that's just being
They're-
Canadian.
They're the Mounties, basically. Like, if you've seen the Mounties, if you've seen Due South, like Paul Gross, etc., in the hat and the red jacket, and like you see the mounted ride, they're those guys. So like they're the iconic vision of Canada. At the same time, they are the people who probably perpetrate the most violence against Indigenous people in Canada.
Well, they're kind of founded for that and to keep the country
Yes.
under control,
hmm
whatever that may mean.
That's basically their purpose is to keep the Indigenous people in line and keep the country under control, especially out west, actually, as the country expanded. I mean, Winnipeg is apparently a really great place to live. They never really got over losing their NHL team. Another point to sort of having,
And they got it back.
They got
were
it back.
so sad about it. They got it back. And we just lost
Oh,
Nicole.
lots of sad reacts for the loss of the Jets, and then happy reacts when they came back.
Yeah, so let's continue since
Let's move on.
we're over time.
We're chewing through time.
Yeah,
With a history lesson.
that's what happens when you have a giant country to live in. Christoph, go ahead, tell us about Alberta and BC.
Well, Alberta and BC are a mirror of each other in the same way that Quebec and Ontario is, but completely different. Alberta's probably one of the most conservative parts of the country, and BC is the most liberal part of the country. We literally don't have a conservative party, so they stuck them in the Liberals. And we have what Americans would call a socialist government right now. And Alberta always tries to hit way above its weight. It's quite small, not as small as any of the plains, but any of the provinces in the plains, but pretty small, like 4 million people. And BC's larger and entirely centered around a place called Vancouver, where I happen to be, where most of the population lives, and is actually where all of the most social liberal and green types is down here in Vancouver and on our island. We have an island people love to bring up. I think it's close to the size of, it's like half the size of Newfoundland or something. I looked it up at one time. It's actually a lot bigger than most people think it is, but it is quite large and physically just protects the inlet where Vancouver is from everything weather-wise. But we just stuck the capital on there too, and it's even more liberal than we are. So that's about it.
Sorry about that.
It's pretty much Seattle meets Oregon, but north of that, and a little, more Canadian. So
And I guess
multicultural to the next level.
Yeah, Alberta economy is focused around oil, obviously. And then BC
oil
economy
And weed now.
BC
and
economy
weed.
is focused on, shipping and lumber.
And weed.
And weed as well.
And all your houses are not brick.
Yeah, we don't have any. We have this one or two brick, like one brick kind of little neighborhood, and then another little brick area near that neighborhood, and then there's a brick church. But that's about it.
That's about it.
And everything in Alberta and BC effectively got built in the 1900s. After 1900.
Oh yeah, we don't
pretty
have
much.
one
Like, there's a little bit of Victoria
indigenous
that's
thing.
a little bit older, but everything is 120 years old max.
Oh, and just to explain everybody, the reason our province put their capital on an island is the island sticks down into the United States, and we wanted to ensure that the 49th parallel was maintained. So we moved after a place burned down outside of Vancouver called New Westminster, which is just a little neighborhood now. They moved the entire capital to a desolate island of trees and rocks and, well, hippies now. And they thought that was a good idea. It costs us millions of dollars to fly politicians back and forth, but it's on an island and it keeps our 49th parallel intact. So there you go.
And then quickly, the North is the North. 3 territories, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, which got bisected and turned into Nunavut, which is I believe, the single largest land claim possibly in the world.
Yeah.
Which is effectively a self-governing Inuit nation that has quasi-provincial status.
Yeah, they have their own
representatives
form of provincial governments, but a little bit different than everyone else too.
So let's just quickly talk about the things we've intentionally ignored. Prince Edward Island, my family's from there. Nova Scotia, one of the oldest parts of the country, includes Halifax. New Brunswick.
Halifax.
Technically, it's the only bilingual province in Canada, and that's because of the Acadians. Quebec is not bilingual.
They're originally from Louisiana, correct?
No. It got swapped over.
Okay.
The Acadians came from Europe 14 generations back or so. Then during the 7 Years' War, a particular individual, General Amherst, decided to find all of the non-combatant French folks and effectively deport them. So roughly a third of them got shipped back to France. Maybe a third of those people actually survived. Roughly a third of them got bumped down the coast until they hit Louisiana, where the Cajuns arose from. And then the remainders hid in the woods, ran off to Quebec, etc. And that's where the existing Acadian population comes from. Those survivors who hid out from ethnic cleansing. Fun times.
This is how much you can talk about the history of a country founded by the Hudson Bay Company.
Yep. And we
exactly. We have a lot of ethnic cleansing in our background for a liberal utopia.
Yeah. So let's, now that we've done that, let's talk a bit about the cultural factors, and then we'll spend like 5 minutes on the business side of things. But it's a lot of culture. So Nicole, do you have any first thoughts?
I will try not to get ranty. I will try not to get ranty about this. But I was thinking a lot when I saw emotional support Canadian trending this week around the election. Yeah. Already shaking your head, right?
I responded to it because it was funny, but you know.
It is funny, but I was sort of like immediately like, oh God, here we go again with this. And I find it really interesting because I thought it really neatly encapsulated in some ways kind of the relationship between the US and Canada. Because this idea of emotional support Canadians really feeds into the myth that the US has of Canada as this liberal utopia to the north where everything's awesome and, you know, people are treated equally and we're nice people that are going to help you out. And Canadians can be nice people that are going to help you out. It's entirely something that we do sometimes. But, and it's very easy, I think, as Canadians to want to feed into that because we like to see ourselves that way. That's why Canadians often get like upset when you're like, there's racism and how dare you call me racist? But this is the way Americans, I think, see us, as the emotional support Canadian, the fuzzy, teddy bear, the fat friend in the chick flick, always there to be supportive and there to be, your safety school and there to be, escape to if things get bad enough in your own country, not cool
Fake
enough.
girlfriends you make up in high school.
Yep. Not cool enough or hot enough to be a threat or, really to be cooler than you, but like always there and never going to turn your back on you. Enough like you that they know, all the same references and know all the same people. But, and Canadians get to see themselves likewise as like nice people who help people out and are polite. And the main point is better than the US. And better than the US is, I'm not going to say it's not always a low bar. Right now it's a low bar. But it's not like that's where we stop. Like we're like, okay, we're better than the US. Great. Done. And
Harmful
I love what
to
this
environmental causes, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I love what this country could be, but I hate what this country thinks it is. In this country, I go around the world to different places and people talk to me and they're like, Canada is such a great place. And then I'm like, yeah, but these are some problems with Canada. And they have no idea. They have no idea that reserves have no clean drinking water. They have no idea that there are police shootings. They have no idea how we treat people. Padfoot, I swear to God, I'm going to kill you. I'm sorry, my cat. They have no idea about these things. And you tell them, and they're like, I had no idea Canada was like this. I'm really glad you told me. This is kind of an awkward conversation, but still. And so it's just that when we feed into these things by being like, oh, we're really emotional support Canadian, like we're like this, we're polite, we're only these things, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the US because it allows us to feel morally superior and them to be like, oh, Canada's so much better than us, and doesn't erases all of our problems and our differences, even in like gaming culture, when we look at that, because we get into conversations and people are like, it's just like the US, everything's the same. And when we say it's not, like there are no, people are just used to thinking of it that way. And it doesn't help us in the sense that we have no impetus to improve. We have no reason to improve.
Absolutely. And so a good analogy that I find for this is Canada is a nice, diplomatic, peaceful, polite society, multicultural society, in the same way that the U.S. is a land of opportunity where anyone can can be successful if they work hard and are entrepreneurs.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, I guess it's part of the definition of polite. People always think of the good part of polite. They always forget about the other parts.
The
of
respectability.
The word polite.
Not the
parts that you're ignoring on purpose so that politeness can happen.
Yeah, I always say
a lot, but
yeah, I always say
it here.
Exactly. I say our politeness is like, or racism is like a passive aggressive racism and not an in your face racism, because so much of Canada
more Indigenous people than most of us, anyways, then outright attack them.
I would argue. I would argue that we outright attack Indigenous people and ignore people of color.
Or it's a microaggressions.
I think it's all true.
Yeah, I mean, it depends where you're from too, and it depends what kind of person you are. Like liberals, I guess what you would say in America, but like what we would call large liberals, NDP supporters, socialists, stick to sort of the microaggressions, the discussions about what kind of people and what people eat and how they smell or something like that, or even CBC did a story that I was astounded on about how the CERB, which was Americans heard that Canadians got $2,000 during the pandemic. That has changed, but it had limitations on it to a certain extent, but the application was very easy. So you could lie about it. They're saying you're going to have to pay it back. If you did, we'll see. But they did, CBC, which is supposed to be left-leaning and is the state broadcaster, did a story that I read recently on the CERB in the North, and it led with some people talking about how if they had gotten it when they were an alcoholic, they would have drank it away, and talking about these rumors of parties, but like Serb parties, how people were spending all of it on booze and weed in Inuit communities, but there was no real like evidence of this other than pictures they'd taken of dumpsters and whatever. But then like right in the middle of the story, they talked to a woman who was able to buy her son a computer so he could distance learn, was able to take some training, and is moving to a larger community because of it, where she can get a better job. And I'm like, CBC didn't lead with that. They led with the Inuits drink and do drugs again, because that's the narrative that we hear all the time. Those natives are drunk all the time. Like, again, like this is sort of what I think we see a lot is the continued narratives, even in
Well, I think one of the big elements that you can take from that is CBC is very Canadian. It's very Canadian. It's slightly left-leaning. It's got weird conservative roots that it kind of ignores. It tries to say that it does this, and it brings, more Indigenous people to panels and stuff as of recently. Now they're dealing with all stuff, but then it does this bullshit at the same time, like simultaneously, left hand, right hand kind of elements. And that would be what you'd say about everything else. I mean, it's just Canadian.
And on that end, the other key thing is les deux solitudes, which is the formal term for the stark cultural divide between English Canada and Quebec. So there's this thing called CanCon, Canadian Content Requirements, which is effectively a lot of subsidies trying to give us a domestic cultural industry to fight back the, quite frankly, cultural imperialism that is Hollywood.
Which we bought into.
But the English CanCon is a mark of derision. It's an insult for our local media industries because of a bunch of things. Now, in Quebec, it's totally different. Because Quebec has a population of 8 million people, and most of them only speak French. This means that they have their own celebrities, their own internal media empires, and all the Quebecers know Quebec culture, Quebec musicians, Quebec actors and actresses, because they don't have to compete with the U.S. They don't because of the linguistic barrier. Quebec maintains its own much stronger Quebec culture than English Canada can for Canadian English culture.
100%, yeah.
But it also means that I can talk to my girlfriend, and she has no idea who Rick Mercer is.
That's a Canadian.
And then she'll talk to me about Les Seuls Boulets, and I'm like, who? Because we just don't see into each other's universes nearly as much, which is part of the cause for all of the drama and issues going on there.
And what's interesting is I don't even think the formats cross over well, because I was involved really briefly at CBC with discussion of making a Tout le monde en parle, which is a huge talk show in Quebec. It's like it's like the style is like politically incorrect, I guess. Would be the closest one to it in terms of a roundtable discussion. I don't know if there's something that's closer to it that you could.
So it is probably like the late night show in terms of prominence in Quebec culture.
Yeah, it's
the
like the late
Prime
night
Minister
show in
has
terms-
shown up and spoken on it.
Yeah. Or it could be like if you've seen Graham Norton. I think maybe the Graham Norton show in terms of the level of celebrities that show up on it and how the discussion goes. Except, I guess the host would be Graham Norton level too, just in Quebec. It just kind of died on the table. And I think part of the reason is that format is just, I see it in Europe a lot and I see it in Quebec, but I don't see it as much in English Canada because they usually have a large amount of guests, like more so than a politically incorrect or even a late show would have. They have like 5 people or 6 people sometimes on the show, not just like 2 people in the host or 3 people in the host. They have a lot more sometimes, and the discussion is very freewheeling, and it seems very French in some ways in its sensibilities, and it didn't go forward in at CBC for whatever reason. And I feel like part of the reason is its Quebecoisness and Frenchness.
Yep. And for clarity, this CBC is in English. Radio Canada is French.
Yep.
They're
Yeah.
twins.
No, they don't. They don't even call it. They're very different. Like even working with Radio Canada folks is very different.
You are
I think that
Abby's jumping
leads
in.
right into games, those tabletop RPG things that we are here to talk about a little bit.
That is exactly what your disembodied moderator was about to say, was you're at 12 minutes out, and we'd love to hear how these factors have informed your game design.
Perfect.
Yes. So one of the things I also want to quickly say is we didn't mention other non-Quebec Francophone communities. That was kind of also on purpose, because there's also a fight between ethnic communities that are not Quebecers within La Francophonie. There's a lot of Franco-Ontarians. There's a lot of Manitobans who are Francophones. There's some in Alberta, some in Saskatchewan, and I mean all of Acadia functionally. So
a few in BC too.
Franco-Ontarians are not Quebecers. They're French Canadians. So that's So how does this affect our games?
Multicultural.
There's no CanCon. There's no CanCon for games. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Which is actually really weird. Yeah.
It is kind of weird that there's no CanCon for games.
It's because it's not really an industry, so it isn't regulated as a media industry. It's a community, which means it's just kind of self-driven. We don't have any major media corporations in Canada that make tabletop role-playing games or even tabletop games at all.
Oh, we did. Guardians of Order.
Yeah,
I'm gonna cut in and mention that Sen is back, but he is a disembodied voice with me, so we're being haunted by Sen in addition to me.
Okay, cool. It's interesting though that there's no CanCon for video games, as there are so many video game companies in Canada.
Yeah, we have the second biggest EA studio. Hi, Sen.
BioWare's in Edmonton.
Ubisoft. You get lots of them.
So how does this affect our games? So there's a lot of issues of some common themes that I've seen are self-deprecating humor as a large sort of cultural element. We've got multiculturalism as a core theme. There's a lot of like multiple cultural groups represented in our games, in my experience. There's a lot of non-violent or less military conflict mechanics in play. So you'll get a lot more like social combat than we're going to shoot you with our many guns that we happen to have at home mechanics. And like language is a thing. Indigenous factors are also a thing.
Since we lost Sen for part of the panel, I'd love to hear how it affects the board and card game side of design.
Sure. So I think in terms of how it affects the board and card game design end of things, it's probably less. But what does happen an awful lot is because board and card games tend to be mechanisms that get themes attached to them, and which is very different than RPGs, which are typically somebody thinks about a theme and says, okay, how do I make that into a game? And it does happen in board and card, of course, but what really happens a lot is that Canada is seen as this weird exotic place, especially by Europeans for some reason. And so they tend to theme some games with like really weird themes that have nothing to do with the world that we live in. Like, so there's a game called Manitoba, and Manitoba is it has like West Coast totem poles in it because that's what they think all people in Canada have around them is totem poles because there's so many Indigenous people here. And so there's just stuff like that. Like the one about the Okanagan Valley has nothing to do with the Okanagan Valley. It's just this literal skin that some company put over it so that it has, some thematic resonance with some place that hasn't been exploited by somebody else. It's basically colonialism by game. And it's real weird. It's really strange sometimes to see that kind of stuff when it's done to your own country, and then you recognize that, oh, wait a minute, we've been doing that too to other places. So obviously, being Chinese Canadian, you see it done all the time to, the Mystic East or whatever, right? But then you see it done to Canada, and you say, look, aren't people a little bit beyond this by now? And they're literally not. And the pushback that happens when you say, hey, I'm from Canada, and that's not what happens in Manitoba, is incredible. Like, people in the publishing industry is like, well, I don't care that you did this game. Really, I don't. I care that what you do on your next game is better. That's what I'm really looking for. I don't want you to change this. I'm not saying go and change this now because you've already paid for the art. You're done. That's fine. It exists. Whatever. But at least acknowledge that you've made some mistakes with your perception of what Canada is. And I can tell you that all four of us on this panel have misconceptions of what Canada is because of our own internal biases. And that just gets extended out and out and out until what Nicole was talking about when, she says, when I travel, everybody thinks Canadians are X. And as a monolithic culture, maybe we are X, but we're individuals inside that culture. And so, it's this type of thing where, and I mean, as a psychology professor, these are just heuristics that we use to identify different areas of the world and people of the world and things like that. And they're shortcuts. They're literal mnemonic shortcuts that we use to say, oh, if it has a totem pole and it's named Manitoba, it must be about Canada. There you go. It's Canada. Something about Canada. And it's wrong. And it's lazy design in my perspective. So I think, we've got these wonderful supercomputers in our pockets that we can use to research these things. And I think people are just lazy about it. And you wouldn't think it would happen to a nation that is as large as Canada, but the problem is that we're actually very, I think, underappreciated as a culture. The diversity of our culture is quite underappreciated, maybe even by the people living in the country itself.
I was going to say, even by ourselves. And one of the things that I love about Jiangxi, which Sen and Banana Chan created, is that it takes a part of culture that is so Canadian that people don't know about, which is just Chinese restaurants across Canada that are created by immigrants or second generation Canadians or whatever that are Canadians running Chinese restaurants in like middle of nowhere small towns. There are Chinese restaurants pretty much anywhere you go, like the smallest town in Saskatchewan, Northern Ontario, Manitoba, wherever. There will be a Chinese restaurant. It may not be authentic Chinese food that you know of, but there is Canadian Chinese food. And the role-playing game is basically built around families that run these places. And it's a huge part of Canadian culture. And a lot of people don't think of that as Canadian culture. But like a lot of us have grown up eating, you know, chicken balls and red sauce and stuff like that, you know, right? Like, so
I didn't.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, well, I did because, you know, I'm white, right? So
Oh, but it's okay.
And on a related note, the element of cultural alienation. Effectively, white English Canadians have a strong feeling of we don't have a culture. We're just being swamped by the US. And there's an inferiority complex in play there, which is exciting.
Oh, 100%.
So
I
I
think
believe
the
we're
one
running out
last
of
thing-
time. So yeah,
I
go
would
ahead.
like
And then
5-minute
we'll...
warning.
Yeah, the one last thing I'd like to say is that I think all of this works down into how the individual communities of Canadian game design tend to be. They all tend to be connected to a cross-border American one of some sort, either as a sister group, if with, you know, New Jersey and Ottawa, or as we're just part of the same group with Seattle and Vancouver, or perhaps a one that kind of just drops in once in a while, like the few designers I know from places like Calgary and other places afar. And I think that's pretty Canadian. I think if you'd look, you'd find that in our game design. We'd love to tell you about how, but we would have needed twice the panel for that. Sorry.
Yeah, very sorry.
in
All
LARP,
right,
there's
so
also
if I could get each of you to spend about 45 seconds telling people where to find you online and where to give you money for the products you produce.
I'll start because I'm loud. My name is Jason Pitre, Genesis of Legend Publishing, at Genesis of Legend on Twitter. And you can download one of my most Canadian games for free because I don't like capitalism. I'm Canadian. It's called Lonely Timbers, and it is a game about historical lumberjacks in Quebec. Nicole?
I'm Nicole Winchester. You can find me at NicoleWinchester.com and at Noise Angel, pretty much everywhere else, especially Twitter. I am also at FairEscapeStudios.com, where I usually do a lot of LARP stuff. That's not really happening much right now. My most recent work is with the Expanse line for Green Ronin. And the Modern Age Handbook is coming out soon, I believe. I also have my most recent game on itch is about American gun culture, actually, which is kind of weird. It's called I Love You, Mom. So you can check that out. It's not fun at time. So I'll just say that right up front. It's not a fun time. Sen.
Hey, I'm Sen-Foong Lim. You can see me at Sen-Foong Lim on Twitter. And my most recent game is probably for RPGs is Jiangshi, Blood in the Banquet Hall, which is available as a late backer. Currently, just search it. It's like probably the only thing that exists about Jiangshi in RPG land. And then my most recent board game it's probably Mind Management, which is based on the New York Times bestselling graphic novel Mind Management. It is a not hidden role, but a hidden movement game for 2 to 5 players, and you can find that as a late backer as well online. Mind Management, the hidden movement game, I think, or no, the psychic espionage game. There you go, Christoph.
All right, last and definitely least, my name is Christoph. You can find me at Zofra on Twitter and most things. And you can find my game at freespacer.com. It's called Free Spacer. And it's about a multicultural space stuff. Anyways, thanks.
So thank you all for joining us, and we are happy to talk in the Panel Watch channel after this. If you have any questions about Canadians, and we will apologize and tell you what we think in a very polite but passive-aggressive way.
We're sorry for talking so long about other stuff. Apologies, because we have to end with apologizing.